Welcome to Pathway to Peace with Terry McIntosh. I'm Gary Morris. This is a timely message in search of a positive truth that brings healing, peace, and safety to the individual as well as the entire nation.
Hello Saints, Terry McIntosh in for a few. I'm presently sharing our testimony with you. And if you're just tuning in, you can catch up by going to youtube.com, locate the search bar, and enter Pathway to Peace with Terry McIntosh. That'll pull us up. This is episode number 27. When we stopped last week, we had just rented a Palestinian home and named it the Jesus House of Prayer. The year was 1996. I borrowed $6,000 from my stepdad to pay for the first year's rental and promised to repay him back in 30 days. Now, I knew it was the right thing to do, and confirmation came in the form of a mail miracle. Friends living at a distance and not knowing anything about our need or what was going on had been saving their tithe checks and asking God what best to do with it. Their letter explained that God told them to send it to us. It contained checks totaling $6,300. Now, Saint, that was $300 more than we needed for the house. And of course, I paid stepdad back as promised. Pop was a generous man whose gifts would prove necessary to keep us on the field. They weren't ministry gifts, they were gifts to all of his various stepchildren. It's just that the church had severed our support and we spent our inheritance on the mission field. It proved worth it. Matthew chapter 13, verses 44 and 46 explains the why of it. Arrangements were made to host the first meeting while the owners were still in the house, and I advertised it to open on September the 27th. And a small number of Palestinian Christians planned to join us for the official openings, which were scheduled for 6 p.m. that day. I was staying at the small fellowship in Bethlehem and was excited about the new work birthing in Jericho. 3 days prior to the scheduled meeting, violence erupted all over the Holy Land in the wake of the Israeli opening of an exit to the Hasmonean Tunnel in Jerusalem's Old City. It was the most violent and bloody confrontation between Jews and Palestinians since the Intifada in 1988. 78 people were killed and they were on the verge of an escalating war. The entrance to Bethlehem's Rachel's Tomb area was a battle zone. Stones lined the road leading into the city, and which was the result of rock-throwing Palestinians confronting armed Israeli soldiers at the checkpoint. I found another way to the ministry house in Bethlehem and hid the Jewish car in a garage to prevent Islamic radicals from burning it. And then one evening, I heard loud noises, and it caused me to peer down into the street where Palestinian soldiers gathered in front of the ministry house. Gunfire could be heard from our position, and I watched the soldiers leave toward the outskirts of town. It was apparent that Israel and Palestine were shooting at each other. And those of us in the house watched the horror unfold on television. The camera brought the action live into the living rooms of everyone. We witnessed Jews and Palestinians shooting at each other, even though we were a safe distance from the action. Outside, we could hear the sirens of the ambulance making trip after trip to pick up the dead and wounded, rushing to the hospital. All the while, we watched it unfold. Christian friends lived near Rachel's tomb, right in the middle of the action. We stayed on the telephone with them off and on while they prayed and struggled to survive. Tear gas fired from the Israeli side crept into their home, but they couldn't run outside to get away from it because of the deadly bullets flying around them. They were trapped and lay on the floor all night praying. Meanwhile, Israel arrested every town in the West Bank. Travel to and fro was prohibited. No one was permitted to travel outside his or her own city by military order. Israel shut down the West Bank. Many families were separated, but traveling meant running the risk of arrest or even death. Back home in the States, news reports filled airtime about the violence taking place. The local TV station in Paducah, Kentucky interviewed my wife Susan and then telephoned to me directly in Bethlehem for an update. Their concern was really appreciated by family and friends. By the morning of September the 27th, 1996, this is the day that the House of Prayer was scheduled to open, violence had escalated to the brink of war. My spirit was stirring within about the meeting in Jericho. I believed that God wanted the house to open as we had promised. and I was determined to do it. Friends advised to abandon the trip to Jericho. It's too dangerous, they said. Now, I was aware of the dangers one could encounter driving a Jewish rental car in the middle of a war and driving from city to city against military orders, but the Spirit of God was saying something different. Go. How could I ignore such an unction? A lesson had been learned in Shiloh in 1992. Realizing that fear is the most effective weapon that Satan possesses, I refused to be intimidated by such tactics. I understood that Satan was behind the violence. One objective was to disrupt the peace and to kill as many people as he could on both sides. In the spirit, I suppose another objective could be to keep the house of prayer in Jericho from opening. It was going to serve as a real threat to the kingdom of Satan. Realizing how significant opening the house really was, I began to see it as a great spiritual battle with all of us as the pawns, some of whom would die this day. I would not be wrong about that. I hand-printed the word press on a piece of paper with a magic marker and went downstairs to the garage and taped a sign onto the car, and I covered up the name of the Jewish rental company. The yellow auto tags were still Jewish, and short of changing tags, there wasn't anything I could do about that. I would have to trust that was enough. Pulling out of Bethlehem the back way, I encountered an Israeli roadblock. The soldier had me halt. He checked my passport and wanted to know who I was and what I was doing. I told him that I had been trapped in Bethlehem and wanted to make my way back into Jerusalem, which was true. He took his time, he frowned and said, "I've never seen a journalist car like this one." He let me pass, and I was on the way through Jerusalem heading down to Jericho. When I first entered Jerusalem and approached the narrow two-lane highway that would take me to Jericho, I turned the wheels and headed in the direction of the oldest city in the world. Satan wasn't going to interfere with God's plan for the house of prayer if I had anything to do with it. It was a lonely ride. It's only about 15 miles down to Jericho from Jerusalem, and normally it took about 20 minutes to drive in those days. It didn't take as long on this particular day. The road was empty, and I drove fast. Oh, I felt a few knots in my stomach, all right, but I knew what the Spirit was saying. I had to press on to meet whatever lay ahead. I could not disobey the leading of the Spirit at such a crucial time. I didn't feel brave. I'm not sure it was bravery, it was just obedience. I was scared, but I knew the Lord was with me in a powerful way. Arriving to Jericho, I encountered a military checkpoint. The city was shut down, nobody in, nobody out. And I was nervous approaching the soldiers. I didn't know what they might do. They were on high alert, and there came a car toward them. Now, I approached the checkpoint very slowly, not supposed to be many cars on the road, and here I am. So I didn't want to upset already nervous soldiers. I pulled up to the checkpoint and stopped. The officer in charge followed normal procedure and checked my passport. Then he told me to turn around and leave. When I saw that he wasn't going to arrest me, I pressed for entry into Jericho. And clever fellow I am, I told him that Israeli officials knew that I was in country and headed for Jericho. Now this was the truth because I had intentionally touched base with Jewish contacts in the Israeli government office via telephone while I was still in Bethlehem. I did it to avoid lying about it if I needed a reason to be in Jericho. I invoked the names of Jewish officials I knew and boldly pretended to be somebody who might be important. Clever fellow, yeah. Well, nothing worked, but I kept pressing. The soldiers had me pull the car to the side of the road, and I got out. They were very nice, but very firm. No entry. And finally, the officer used his phone to call his commander on my behalf, but the reply came back, no entry. It was clear that they were not going to let me into Jericho. Not wanting to risk getting arrested, I returned to the car and turned around. But instead of taking the main road back into Jerusalem, I swung the car east toward Jordan on the Jericho bypass, which is used by tour buses and Israelis who live in settlements in the West Bank. I wasn't familiar with the road at the time, but it basically makes a large loop around the city. As I drove, I could see the city easily from the distance, sitting in the desert with an unobstructed view. Israeli soldiers were in control, and when I could see a way in, I was discouraged by the presence of those patrols. Making a sudden rush through the backside could mean instant trouble and possibly death. So I kept driving. Oh, and praying, Saint. A second entrance to Jericho sat east of the Allenby Bridge. When I drew near it, I encountered a second military checkpoint, and I tried all those clever tricks again. I mentioned names, but no name I mentioned helped at all. They told me to go away now. They were not as tolerant as the first checkpoint had been. I turned around, but I didn't give up hope, because I know our God is great. I was filled with faith given to me from God Himself. It had to be. But I was getting desperate. So I started driving, circling around to the north, considering how I might enter Jericho, and I was crying out to God for help. I was confident that He had inspired me to drive down here in the midst of all this conflict and to open as planned. I never doubted it, but I knew that the final call was in His hands. Had I been wrong about it? I prayed, Lord, this is yours, not mine. I can't do it. If you want this house of prayer open today, and if I've been hearing from you, you have to do it. Now, I was not in control, Saint. Tears rolled down my face. I'm not embarrassed to tell you that. Literal tears rolled down my face. And then, to my surprise, I stumbled upon a third military checkpoint with an entry into Jericho from the northern side. I'd never seen it before because I had not ventured to the northern entrance, but there it was, and it was heavily guarded. Soldiers were in position, and the checkpoint was heavily manned. And as I drew near to it, I knew in my heart that this was the final approach. It was now or never. I felt very tense, and my stomach ached. The officer in charge waved with an outstretched hand, motioning me to stop. Now, it was truly now or never. The window was rolled down, and as I approached the officer, I blurted out, "In the name of Jesus, let me in." I had not planned to do it. It just came out of my mouth. The officer asked what I wanted, and I said, "I have some business in Jericho." He hesitated, but he said, "If I let you in, you'll have to stay." I responded quickly and said, "Okay." So within the span of a few seconds, I was in Jericho. The Lord had won the battle. Blast you, Satan. I serve a great God. No other name got me in but that of Jesus Christ. This was the second time I was compelled to invoke the name of Jesus in a circumstance regarding Israel. The first time was when I addressed Israel in the video defending Christian Jews, and now this second time. It had worked both times. I knew it wasn't a matter of ritual, rather one of relationship, and for the purpose of God, not my purpose. The officer risked his military career to let me pass in spite of military orders not to let anybody in or out. A true miracle had happened. I wonder what he was thinking. I'll never know for sure, but something spiritual happened when I demanded he let me in. I had never looked a human being in the eye and told him to do anything in the name of Jesus up until then, and I haven't done it again since. Moving on into the city, I discovered the streets were empty. The restaurants were closed, and most everyone were inside their homes. It was Friday, the Muslim holy day, and devout Muslims were all in the local mosque observing Islamic prayers. Hey, gotta run. God bless you. McIntosh out.
You can write us at Post Office Box 766, Paducah, Kentucky 42002, USA. That's Post Office Box 766, Paducah. That's spelled P-A-D-U-C-A-H, Paducah, Kentucky 42002, USA.